The shadows of power, a political reckoning. Have you ever wondered how power truly operates in Washington? Not the kind you see on C-SPAN. Not the scripted speeches or the orchestrated outrage on primetime television. Real power moves in the shadows, where billions of taxpayer dollars change hands without oversight. Where laws are shaped long before they reach the chamber floor. Where the right connections can make scandals vanish as if they never existed. But today, those shadows were being dragged into the light. The air inside the Capitol was thick, not with humidity. Not with the weight of history pressing against its marble pillars. But with something far more volatile: anticipation. Fear. The kind of tension that settles in just before something irreversible takes place. Beyond the towering columns, down echoing corridors, past security checkpoints where aides whispered anxiously into their phones. The hearing room awaited. Outside, chaos. The press had gathered in full force, a sea of cameras and murmured speculation. The mainstream networks had deployed their top anchors, the ones skilled in shaping narratives. But even they knew, this was beyond their control. The true power brokers, the ones whose names never appear on ballots but whose influence stretches from boardrooms to private jets, were watching from a distance. This wasn't just another hearing. This was a battle for survival. And then, James Comer walked in, a man of sharp instincts and sharper words. Comer had built his reputation not on empty rhetoric but on relentless pursuit. As chairman of the House Oversight Committee, he wasn't interested in grandstanding. He was interested in answers. While others played political theater, Comer preferred a direct approach, the kind that made career politicians shift uncomfortably in their seats. No hesitation, no sideways glances, no unnecessary theatrics. He moved with the certainty of a man who had come not to debate, but to dismantle. In his hand, a stack of papers, unassuming, simple, but for those who knew what was coming, those pages might as well have been an execution order. They weren't just about Schiff. They weren't just about USAID or the billions funneled through backdoor channels. They pointed to something far bigger, something that, if proven true, could rewrite the narrative of modern American politics. Comer took his seat. The cameras followed. The whispers faded. And then, silence. The kind of silence that precedes an earthquake. He glanced at the papers in front of him. Then at the man sitting across the table. Let's talk about the truth, shall we? And just like that, the battle began. 24 hours earlier, the calm before the storm. The halls of the Capitol were eerily quiet. Not the silence of peace, but the heavy pause before a storm. Outside, the media frenzy had yet to reach its peak. But inside the Democratic National Committee headquarters, panic had already taken root. In a private conference room, one that had witnessed countless strategy meetings, damage control sessions, and whispered negotiations meant to shield the party from crisis, the stakes had never been higher. This wasn't about taking down an opponent. This was about survival. Adam Schiff sat at the long mahogany table, shoulders squared, but his grip on the armrest of his chair was just a little too tight. Around him, a dozen party insiders, senior strategists, and legal advisors exchanged uneasy glances. No one wanted to be the first to speak the words aloud. But the fear in the room was unmistakable. Then, finally, a voice cut through the tension. If you don't shut Comer down tomorrow, we won't protect you. Schiff turned his head sharply. The words had come from a senior strategist, a man whose job had never been to sugarcoat reality. The weight of the statement was clear. Schiff was on his own. Silence followed, not the respectful kind, but the kind that comes when a man realizes just how alone he truly is. Schiff let out a slow breath and forced himself to smirk. They have nothing. The confidence in his tone was carefully calculated. If he showed doubt now, the sharks in the room would only circle closer. But the strategist across from him wasn't convinced. Do you really believe that? A few heads turned. Others stayed fixed on their phones, scrolling through headlines, searching for a reassurance that wasn't there. Schiff hesitated, a fraction too long. And that's when the second blow landed. Comer isn't coming for a debate. The strategist continued. He's coming for blood. The statement was blunt. No one refuted it. They all knew James Comer. He wasn't a showman. He wasn't looking for a viral moment. He was a man with a mission, and that made him dangerous. A younger aide, still naive enough to believe in spin, spoke hesitantly. Maybe we should get ahead of this. Leak something. Turn the narrative before Comer takes control. Schiff's patience was wearing thin. Leak what? His voice came out sharper than intended. There's nothing on Comer. No scandal. No skeletons in his closet. And that was the problem. Washington ran on leverage, on knowing where the bodies were buried and who could be squeezed. But Comer was different. He wasn't part of the usual machine. He was methodical, relentless, and worst of all, he had the truth on his side. Then came the third and final blow. If you stumble tomorrow, the strategist said, leaning back in his chair, you're not just taking yourself down, you're taking others with you. Schiff clenched his jaw. He had weathered storms before, survived political attacks that would have buried lesser men. But Washington had no patience for liabilities. If tomorrow's hearing spiraled out of control, his allies would abandon him without hesitation. He had one night to figure out how to stop Comer. The showdown. And now, 24 hours later, he sat in that hearing room, face to face with his adversary, bracing for the fight ahead. For a moment, the room held its breath. Schiff sat motionless, his fingers curled against the table, his expression carefully composed, but there was a flicker, just a flicker, of something behind his eyes. He had spent years maneuvering through hearings like these, bending narratives to his will. But this wasn't just another partisan skirmish. This was an ambush, and Comer had fired the first shot. Across from him, James Comer didn't blink. Congressman Schiff, let's be clear about something. Comer began, his voice measured but unyielding. You and your colleagues have spent years portraying yourselves as defenders of democracy, guardians of transparency, and yet, the very government you claim to protect, he picked up a document, tapping it once against the table, has been nothing more than an ATM for your political allies. The weight of the accusation settled over the room. A few Democrats shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Some Republicans exchanged knowing glances. The journalists in the back, pens poised, were already crafting the next day's headlines. Schiff finally spoke, voice steady but laced with controlled irritation. Mr. Chairman, with all due respect, I'm not sure what wild conspiracy theory you're trying to push here. This isn't a theory. Comer cut him off, sliding a document forward. It's a ledger, a paper trail, transactions, accounts, money moving in places it shouldn't be. Schiff didn't look down. Instead, he leaned back, adjusting his tie, exhaling through his nose, more annoyed than concerned. Comer smiled, but there was no humor in it. Oh, don't worry, he said, the facts will be checked thoroughly. And just like that, the storm broke. James Comer didn't need to raise his voice. The weight of his words alone sent a chill through the room. Let's not insult anyone's intelligence here. We all know USAID isn't just a development agency, it's a convenient cash pipeline. A slush fund disguised as foreign aid. And somehow, it always seems to benefit the same circle of Democratic power brokers. A flicker of discomfort rippled through the room. Schiff, ever the seasoned operator, kept his face neutral. He had faced political attacks before and survived them. He wasn't about to let this be any different. Adjusting his microphone, he leaned in with a tone of righteous indignation. USAID is an important institution that protects national interests. Ah, there it was, the bureaucratic hymn of Washington. Schiff had just invoked the sacred doctrine of government necessity, the all-purpose shield used to deflect scrutiny from programs that mysteriously hemorrhage billions of taxpayer dollars into oblivion. According to this logic, questioning where the money actually goes was somehow equivalent to attacking the institution itself. Comer, unimpressed, picked up a document from the stack before him, holding it between two fingers like something he wouldn't touch without gloves. Fascinating. Then maybe you can explain why millions of dollars from USAID have ended up in the hands of organizations with direct ties to the Democratic Party? Because from where I'm sitting, this doesn't look like foreign aid. It looks like a taxpayer-funded money laundering scheme. Schiff didn't look at the document. He didn't need to. He already knew what was in it. Instead, he exhaled sharply, straightened his tie, and went for the Democrats' usual escape hatch, the trump card. The Trump administration cut government spending just to give tax breaks to the rich. A pivot so clumsy it could have been mistaken for satire. Schiff wasn't even pretending to address the accusation. He was playing a different game entirely. The Washington two-step, where a direct question is met with an unrelated outrage soundbite. The hope, of course, was that if he said, Trump, enough times, the media would take care of the rest. But Comer wasn't the type to let a man squirm his way out of a corner so easily. He leaned forward slightly, his tone razor sharp. That's a cute dodge, Congressman, but we're not talking about tax cuts. We're talking about a publicly funded federal agency hemorrhaging money into political pet projects. And since you brought up the economy, maybe you can explain why 70% of the jobs created under the Biden administration exist in the public sector, and why 99.2% of those jobs are filled by foreign workers. Boom. Schiff's lips parted slightly. His eyes flicked toward the cameras for a fraction of a second before recovering. The deflection had failed. The numbers weren't abstract rhetoric. They were a brick wall, one Schiff had just slammed into face first. The usual low murmur of partisan support that typically followed Schiff's remarks had died down. A few Democratic colleagues suddenly found their papers very interesting. The press pool, previously poised to parrot Schiff's narrative, was now scribbling furiously. For the first time, Schiff looked like a man who understood just how bad this was going to get. The room had shifted, not in the literal sense. No chairs scraped against the floor. No one stood up or made a scene. But something more visceral had changed. A slow, creeping awareness that the ground beneath them was no longer solid. The slap of the folder against the polished wooden table was loud in the silence that followed. Schiff barely flinched, but Comer saw it. That brief, involuntary reaction, the half-second where Schiff's expression flickered before snapping back into place. Schiff had played this game long enough to know that losing composure, even for an instant, was a death sentence. But Comer wasn't here to play games. He placed his hands flat on the table, fingers spread slightly, grounding himself before he drove the next nail into the coffin. Then, with the kind of slow, deliberate cadence that forces people to listen, he spoke. Why is it, Congressman Schiff, that the moment we started pulling at this thread, your colleagues began selling their homes and securing legal counsel like the apocalypse was around the corner? A murmur rippled through the chamber. Schiff let out a tight exhale and tilted his chin slightly upward. A man preparing to absorb the impact of an incoming blow. That's ridiculous, he said flatly, folding his hands together. People move all the time. Are you seriously suggesting that private citizens don't have the right to relocate? Comer's mouth twitched, not quite a smirk, but something close. Sure, people move all the time, he said, but they don't usually move all at once. In the dead of night. With desperate fire sale listings on homes they seemed quite comfortable in just weeks ago. They don't all just wake up one morning and decide it's time to find a criminal defense attorney, or start Googling things like, how far back does a federal subpoena reach? A rustling noise, a few papers shifting in hands, a throat clearing from the Democratic side of the room. Schiff, ever the tactician, didn't turn to look. Instead, he gave a tight, incredulous laugh. Oh, come on, Mr. Chairman, this is a joke. Next you'll be telling me that people searching for how to delete emails permanently is somehow part of your grand conspiracy. Funny you should mention that, Comer interjected smoothly, flipping a page, because that's on the list too. This time, Schiff's composure did crack, subtle, but there. The way his fingers briefly curled into a fist before smoothing out again. The way his lips pressed together just a fraction too long before he exhaled through his nose. This is baseless fear-mongering, he snapped. You don't have evidence. You have coincidences that you're trying to spin into a scandal. Comer didn't blink. Is that what you're calling it? A coincidence? He lifted a single sheet of paper, holding it between his fingers like a playing card. This coincidence right here. One that shows a surge of high-profile wire transfers coming out of Washington, D.C., many of them routed through the same financial institutions that just so happened to be connected to USAID disbursements. Schiff's response was immediate. You have no proof that those transactions are linked to anything illegal. Not yet, Comer agreed. He let the words settle, watching as Schiff's nostrils flared ever so slightly. Then, with quiet amusement, he added, but your friends sure seem to think we will soon. Otherwise, why are they running? Schiff leaned forward now, both hands on the table, his voice measured but steely. Let's be clear about something, Mr. Chairman, he said. You are attempting to weave together a fabricated narrative based on speculation, internet searches, and real estate transactions. If this is the kind of evidence you're relying on, Then it's no wonder your investigations never go anywhere. Comer tapped the folder again. Just once. A quiet, deliberate gesture that somehow carried more weight than a raised voice ever could. They never go anywhere? He repeated. Then why do I get the feeling your party is already drafting statements on how to distance itself from certain members? Why do I hear whispers about how some people in your own ranks are saying this investigation might be too big to ignore? Schiff's jaw tensed. This was bad. Very bad. Not because Comer had all the answers, he didn't. Not yet. But he had just enough. Enough to make people start asking questions Schiff didn't want asked. And worst of all, Schiff knew that in Washington, survival wasn't about loyalty. It was about self-preservation. And if Comer kept pushing, if the pressure continued to mount, it wouldn't be long before someone in Schiff's own party decided to cut their losses. The kind of silence that wasn't a pause but a verdict, the absence of defense. Comer had laid out his case. The paper trail damning, the exodus from Washington undeniable. The questions he posed hung in the air like smoke after a detonation, unanswered. Undeniable, unavoidable. And now, Schiff was looking around, not for a rebuttal, but for support. There was none. Across the room, the Democratic bench sat uncomfortably still. Some had their heads down, pretending to review documents they weren't reading. Others avoided eye contact entirely. The few who remained upright weren't leaning forward to defend Schiff but leaning away, as if hoping to avoid the blast radius. Then, the first man stood. A mid-level congressman who had been shifting uncomfortably for the past 15 minutes grabbed his folder, adjusted his tie, and quietly walked out. And then another. And another. They didn't storm out in protest. Didn't make a scene, because this wasn't defiance. It was survival. A quiet, calculated retreat from a battlefield they had decided was no longer worth dying on. Schiff saw it, felt it. He could read the subtext as clearly as a headline. You're on your own. And then, in the midst of the silence, a new sound cut through the air, the unmistakable scrape of a chair being pushed back forcefully. Ilhan Omar shot up, her expression a portrait of barely contained rage. She wasn't like the others. She wasn't here to slink away in quiet humiliation. She was here to fight. This is what happens when you let the establishment run the show. She snapped, eyes flashing as she turned, not to Comer, but to her own party. You all wanted to play it safe. You thought you could ride the fence forever. Well, look where that got us. Beside her, AOC nodded, arms crossed, expression carved in frustration. Where's the defense? She demanded, sweeping her gaze across the remaining Democrats. Where's the leadership? The room remained frozen. No one answered, because no one had an answer. Schiff sat rigid, his jaw tight, his fingers curling slightly against the table. He didn't react, didn't turn to face them, because he knew they weren't talking to him anymore. They were talking about him. And they weren't alone. The journalists in the back of the room, the ones who had once been Schiff's quiet allies, the ones who had softened headlines and redirected narratives in his favor, were suddenly scribbling notes with newfound enthusiasm. Because something had shifted. This wasn't just about the allegations anymore. This was about a party breaking apart in real time. And as Schiff sat there, unmoving, the cameras captured it all, captured the cracks in the foundation, captured the moment his own allies decided he was no longer worth protecting. The hearing room still hummed with the aftershocks of what had just transpired. But outside, the real spectacle had already begun. The press was waiting. The steps of the Capitol, usually a backdrop for carefully curated sound bites and calculated exits, had transformed into a battlefield. Reporters were packed shoulder to shoulder. Cameras angled, microphones extended, all poised to capture the wreckage. Adam Schiff had been through this routine before. He knew how to navigate the press, how to dodge a question with just the right amount of feigned outrage, how to spin a headline before it had a chance to cement itself. But today was different. Today, he wasn't shaping the narrative. He was the narrative. The moment he stepped outside, they descended. Senator Schiff, do you deny that the Democratic Party is in crisis? Do you stand by your testimony? Or do you have anything to correct? Are you prepared to address the claims that USAID funds were funneled into partisan organizations? The questions came rapid fire. A chaotic storm of accusations and demands for explanations. Schiff kept moving, his jaw tight, his shoulders squared, but his silence only emboldened them. And then, The one question he had been dreading. Senator Schiff, did you lie to Congress? He stopped. For half a second. A fraction of hesitation. Just enough. The cameras caught everything. Inside newsrooms across the country. Producers pounced. Clips were being cut. Segments were being arranged. Headlines were already in draft. Over at Fox News, Tucker Carlson leaned into the camera with his signature half-smirk. Voice laced with that knowing blend of amusement and condemnation. Well, folks, there you have it. We just watched Adam Schiff, the so-called moral compass of the Democratic Party, get publicly dismantled in front of Congress. Turns out, when confronted with actual facts, all he had left was silence. The same Schiff who spent years preaching about protecting democracy just got a first-hand lesson in what accountability looks like. The reaction was instant. On MSNBC, anchors scrambled to reframe the story. Schiff wasn't a man cornered by his own lies. He was the victim of a partisan witch hunt. On CNN, damage control was in full swing. Unsubstantiated allegations, Republican theatrics, a manufactured scandal. But it wasn't working, because the footage told its own story. Schiff, stone-faced, eyes down, lips pressed together, weaving his way through the crowd without a word. For years, he had wielded the press as a weapon, dictating the tempo, controlling the headlines. But today, the press wasn't on his side. And that silence, the silence that had once been a tactic, a means of avoiding missteps, had now become his greatest admission of guilt. If the hearing had been the spark and the media frenzy the gasoline, then social media was the explosion. By the time Adam Schiff's motorcade had pulled away from the Capitol, the internet had already sealed his fate. The headlines had barely settled before Twitter, no, X, erupted into a firestorm. #Schiff resign was no longer just trending. It was dominating. At first, it was the usual political commentators weighing in, conservative pundits, independent journalists, and a few Democratic operatives who were clearly testing the waters before deciding whether to disavow him. But within an hour, it had spread far beyond the usual circles. Celebrities, comedians, even apolitical meme accounts that normally stuck to viral cat videos and celebrity gossip had joined in. Schiff's implosion was no longer just a political scandal. It was entertainment. Every second, thousands of posts flooded the platform. Some outraged, some gleeful, and others crafted with a kind of merciless precision that only social media could deliver. How does it feel, Schiff? Years of deception finally catching up to you. Democrats have two choices: cut him loose or go down with him. Either way, it's over. A video clip of Schiff's credibility leaving his body, attached to a gif of a sinking ship. The memes followed, hundreds, maybe thousands of them. But one in particular spread like wildfire. A freeze frame of Schiff seated before the Oversight Committee. Head lowered, shoulders slumped, an expression of quiet resignation settling on his face. The caption, "When even your own party doesn't believe your lies anymore." Reposted endlessly. On Facebook groups, Reddit forums, even Instagram stories of influencers who normally wouldn't touch politics with a 10-foot pole. Schiff's disgrace had become mainstream. Late-night comedians pounced. Within hours, skits were being written, monologues drafted. Even networks that had once shielded Schiff from scrutiny were now cracking jokes at his expense, sensing that his political usefulness had expired. Adam Schiff was no stranger to political fights. But this wasn't a fight. This was an execution. And everywhere he looked, his downfall was playing on a loop. Behind closed doors, the real war had begun. The Democratic Party's headquarters, once a sanctuary of strategy and control, now felt more like a crime scene. A battlefield littered with the wreckage of a political catastrophe too massive to spin. The foundation that had once seemed unshakable was now splintering, the fractures deepening with every passing hour. And at the center of it all stood Adam Schiff, a man abandoned by the very machine he had served so loyally. The meeting was supposed to be confidential. But in Washington, secrets had a shorter lifespan than scandals. This is unsustainable, a centrist congressman from a vulnerable swing district said flatly, his voice betraying no emotion, only calculation. "We need to cut our losses before this drags the entire party down." The phrase hung in the air like a guillotine waiting to drop. Murmurs of agreement followed. Schiff had been useful once, a loyal soldier, a relentless attack dog. But now, he was a liability. And in politics, liabilities weren't protected, they were discarded. Across the table, Ilhan Omar's arms were crossed, her expression a storm of fury and disdain. "You people are unbelievable," she snapped, her voice slicing through the room's growing unease. When he was attacking Republicans, you couldn't get in line fast enough. But the second the heat turns up, you're ready to throw him to the wolves? AOC nodded beside her, fire in her eyes. "This party has no backbone, no strategy, no direction," she said, scanning the room, daring anyone, to push back against the unraveling. No one did. But the final blow didn't come from Schiff's so-called allies. It came from the money. A top donor, one of the Democratic Party's financial titans, a name spoken in fundraising circles with hushed reverence, had sent an unmistakable warning. "If you don't handle this, we will." And in Washington, everyone knew exactly what that meant. Money wasn't just the lifeblood of a campaign. It was power. And if the donors pulled out, if the corporate sponsors hesitated, if the lobbyists shifted their resources elsewhere, then Schiff's fate wouldn't be decided in backroom meetings. It would be sealed. The message was clear. Schiff had become radioactive. And just like that, this wasn't just about him anymore. It was about survival. In his office, Schiff sat alone, the flickering light from the television casting eerie shadows against the wall. The air was heavy, not with the stale scent of politics, but with something far worse. Defeat. On the screen, news anchors dissected his downfall with surgical precision. Their words deliberate, their tone a careful balance of feigned neutrality and unmistakable glee. The chyron at the bottom of the screen was brutal. Schiff abandoned. Democrats distanced themselves from fallen leader. The headline barely registered. Schiff had spent years mastering the media cycle, had been on the other side of it, pushing narratives, controlling damage, weaponizing perception. But now, he wasn't shaping the headlines. He was the headline. His phone vibrated. Again, and again, and again. He didn't check. He already knew. First had come the reporters, hungry for a quote, desperate to spin a new angle out of the wreckage. He had ignored them. Then, the party operatives, carefully worded texts, urgent yet impersonal calls. They wanted assurances. They wanted to know if he would fight or fold. He had ignored those, too. And then, silence. The kind of silence that meant they had already moved on. Now, only two types of people were still reaching out: opportunists and the desperate. Either they wanted something from him, or they were just checking to see if he was still breathing. His laptop sat on the desk, unopened. For hours, he had avoided it, but now, with a slow, resigned movement, he reached forward and lifted the screen. Twitter, no, X as they called it now, glowed back at him. And there it was. #Schiff resign. Still trending at number 1. It wasn't slowing down. If anything, it was accelerating. The volume of posts was staggering. Memes, videos, unfiltered ridicule, clips from the hearing, from his press walkout, from the moment his own party turned on him, each looped, edited, and overlaid with captions designed to twist the knife. He wasn't just a politician in trouble. He was a spectacle. Schiff had built his brand on being untouchable, the face of the anti-Trump resistance, the righteous warrior who never backed down. But now, his silence was his admission of guilt. His jaw tightened as he scrolled. Dems used him and tossed him like garbage. Loyalty means nothing in D.C. This is what happens when you get high on your own supply of manufactured scandals. Attached, a slow-motion clip of the Hindenburg disaster. Enough. He exhaled sharply, slamming the laptop shut. His head fell back against the chair, eyes tracing the ceiling. The realization settled in like a slow poison. There would be no redemption arc, no grand comeback. The machine he had served so faithfully had deemed him expendable. And across town, someone else was already moving forward. In his office, James Comer leaned back in his chair, watching as his team buzzed with quiet intensity. Aides shuffled papers, passed notes, whispered among themselves. The Schiff takedown had been brutal, efficient, but it was only the beginning. Comer flipped through a freshly assembled dossier, running his fingers along the top of the stack. The ink on Schiff's political obituary wasn't even dry. And already, the next battle was taking shape. A knock at the door. One of his aides stepped in, a notepad in hand. Anticipation laced in his voice. So, what's next? Comer tapped the file once. A slow, knowing smile spreading across his face. Now, he said, voice steady, we move to the next name on the list. Across town, Schiff's television flickered. The news cycle had already shifted. The conversation was moving forward. The storm had passed. But for Washington? This was no conclusion. This was just the beginning.